I'm Teresa.
And I'm Callista, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime. Today, we're discussing John Lennon. We'll talk about his extraordinary life from his humble beginnings in working class Liverpool, England, to his meteoric rise to one of the most famous and influential songwriters of all time in one of the world's arguably most famous bands. John left a lasting impact on the music industry before his life tragically ended at the age of 40 when he was shot numerous times by disillusioned fan Mark David Chapman. John Lennon was born while bombs were literally going off around the hospital on October 9th, 1940, to Julia and her husband Alfred, who was a merchant marine and not present at John's birth. Julia gave John the middle name Winston after the UK's Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill. Alfred was mostly absent from young John's life. Julia found motherhood itself a struggle, and caring for a young child, mostly alone, only added to the difficulty. So, Julia's sister, Mary Elizabeth, or Mimi, suggested that she and her husband George, who had no children of their own, could provide a more stable home for young John. Julia agreed, and Mimi and her husband George raised John from the time he was 5 through his adolescence.
Julia was still very much involved in John's life and would often visit John at George and Mimi's home. It was Julia who bought John his first guitar. When John would visit Julia at her house, they would listen to Elvis Presley. Julia was fun and high spirited. John got his unique sense of humor from her. Julia passed on her love of music to John and taught him to play the banjo and the ukulele. Mimi, frustrated with John's continued fascination with the guitar, famously said, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." Mimi didn't approve of rock and roll and thought that people who listened to it were low class. She wanted John to stay focused on schoolwork. Mimi didn't know that John was taking this music thing seriously. In 1956, he had formed his first band, the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen played skiffle, which is a genre of folk music with influences from American folk music, blues, country, bluegrass, and jazz. John's true music love was American rock and roll. Unbelievably, no place in town allowed them to play that type of music. Rock and roll music had a bad reputation since the movie Rock Around the Clock came to Britain the prior year, and teens watching the movie tore up their movie seats so that they could dance to Bill Haley and the Comets. Britain's establishment was afraid of the music's power. The BBC refused to play it on TV or radio.
Don't let the devil's music possess the children.
I mean, exactly. I find that so amusing. But that didn't mean that rock and roll was going away. Obviously not. On July 15th, 1957, the number one song in the UK was Elvis Presley's All Shook Up. John had first heard of Elvis from a schoolmate and that he had throngs of women screaming and fainting when he sang Heartbreak Hotel and thrust his hips on stage. So scandalous. John bought the record, and at night he would take the radio to bed and under the covers would listen to medium wave radio's Luxembourg, which played all of the famous American rock songs.
John and his band members listened to Elvis, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard, and tried to mimic the chord progression. Having reinvented their sound, on July 6th, 1957, the Quarrymen were scheduled to play at St. Peter's Church. 15-year-old Paul McCartney and his friend Ivan Vaughan, who knew John, headed to the church to hear John and his band. Everyone around Liverpool knew who John was. With his upturned collar, sideburns, and swagger, he was instantly recognizable. John was known as cocky and confident, and unfortunately, people around town had labeled him as a hoodlum. Paul's dad, James, had warned Paul to stay away from John, telling Paul that John would get him into trouble. Thankfully, Paul, as any 15-year-old would, ignored his dad's warning. John, for his part, didn't care that Paul was a year younger than him. He had written songs and knew how to play both the guitar and the piano. John wanted him as part of the Quarrymen. But tragedy threatened John's musical ambitions when, on July 15th, 1958, he lost his beloved mother. After leaving Mimi and George's house, she was on Menlove Avenue, heading toward the bus stop when off duty police officer Eric Clegg hit her with his car, killing the 44-year-old instantly. Having lost his mother at the tender age of 17, John had a hard time processing his grief, and as many before and after him, turned to alcohol to numb his pain. And John's father certainly wasn't around to help his son through his loss, as John didn't have contact with him until the mid 1960s when they reconnected, though their contact was intermittent at best. Since there is not a lot of information regarding Alfred, we're going to assume he reached out to John when he realized the level of his fame.
And that rise to fame wasn't far off because Paul introduced George Harrison to John the following year. George and his art school friend Stuart Sutcliffe joined the Quarrymen. Needing a drummer, the group decided on Pete Best in 1960. The first recording the band made was Buddy Holly's That'll Be the Day in 1958. After the Quarrymen became known as the Beatles, they were discovered by Brian Epstein in 1961 at Liverpool's Cavern Club, where they had been performing regularly. The band then underwent even more changes. Stewart died on April 10, 1962, due to a cerebral hemorrhage or brain bleed. He had been experiencing severe headaches and light sensitivity for a while before his sudden death at 21, but the exact cause of the hemorrhage was not determined. Pete was also fired in 1962 for his lack of drumming skills and overall fit with the band. So Ringo Starr, real name Richard Starkey, became the fourth Beatle in 1962. Brian Epstein secured their record contract with EMI, and the group released their first single, Love Me Do, on October 5th, 1962. John wrote their next single, Please Please Me. That same year, John married Cynthia Powell, who he had met at the Liverpool College of Art on August 23rd, 1962. From the beginning, their relationship was rocky. Cynthia has said that there were numerous extramarital affairs. She was also kept out of the spotlight and told to keep their marriage secret so as not to anger the legions of female fans. I mean, heaven forbid the rabid female fans are hit with a dose of reality that you're not going to date a member of the band. They have lives outside of their music.
It does seem like it would be healthy for them, or really anyone, to realize that their crush, shockingly, might not like them back.
Too right. Cynthia said that John had a violent temper, and once while they were dating, he became jealous when she was dancing with Stuart. He hit her, and they broke up. 3 months later, John apologized profusely, and she took him back. Their son Julian, named after John's mother Julia, was born on April 8th, 1963. Being that this was the 1960s, when Cynthia, who had recently graduated and was working as an art teacher, found out she was pregnant, there really wasn't another option than to get married and have the baby.
Mirroring his own start in life, John wasn't present at Julian's birth. Instead, he was on the road with the Beatles. His marriage to Cynthia and his parentage of Julian suffered because of his obligations to the band and touring schedule. But he wasn't just an absent husband and father. Cynthia said that John was verbally abusive throughout their ill fated union. John would later say in a 1980 Playboy article, I used to be cruel to my woman, and physically, any woman. I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I hit. I fought men, and I hit women. But I sincerely believe in love and peace. I am a violent man who has learned not to be violent and regrets his violence. I will have to be a lot older before I can face in public how I treated women as a youngster. And I guess all we can hope is that that's true and that he did feel genuine remorse and change.
I mean, age often brings regret. Hopefully, he really did change.
Hmm. While his personal life was more than slightly problematic, his success was spectacular. As we all know, the Beatles would become one of the most famous bands in the history of music. The height of Beatlemania hit in 1964 when the band traveled to America to perform on The Ed Sullivan Show. Their first TV appearance was watched by 73 million viewers. For context, there were about 192 million people in the US in 1964. That means more than a third of the population tuned in to watch the Beatles. They were the first British band to truly make it big in the US. In fact, the Beatles launched the British invasion of rock bands coming to the US. The Rolling Stones and the Kinks were some of the many bands that followed their lead. But their immense popularity wasn't being ignored back in their home country. In June of 1965, Queen Elizabeth II announced that the Beatles would be awarded the MBE, Member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. It was the first time that such an award was bestowed upon pop stars since the MBE is usually awarded to veterans of war.
They seem to be making history wherever they went. On August 15th, 1965, the band performed for 55,600 fans at New York's Shea Stadium. This was considered the first major stadium rock concert. Upon their return to their home country, they recorded Rubber Soul, which was a departure from their usual repertoire of pop infused love songs. The Beatles' final concert was at San Francisco's Candlestick Park on August 29th, 1966. The band took a much needed break and then returned to the studio to record Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This album would instigate a seismic shift in the way bands would record music in the future. It was one of the first albums to use multi-tracking, experimenting with different sounds and layering instrumentation. It also incorporated lyrics on the album sleeve. The album highlighted the perception of music as an art form and was also the first album that had no traditional gaps between songs. The album was released during the Summer of Love and became a soundtrack for the counterculture movement. For many years, Rolling Stone magazine ranked Sgt. Pepper's as the greatest album of all time. Brian Epstein, who Paul referred to as the fifth Beatle, since he discovered them and was really integral to their success, died of an accidental overdose of sleeping pills on August 27, 1967. This was not a suicide. An autopsy determined that he had simply taken too many sleeping pills over a long period of time without allowing the prior pills to clear from his body. He was 32. Brian's death was the beginning of the end for the Fab Four. Paul was playing quasi-band leader, and the other members were chafing at his assumed authority.
The strain behind the scenes also started to affect some of their songs. The group went on to record and release Magical Mystery Tour on November 27, 1967, which failed to set the world on fire. The band also began to experiment with a variety of drugs and retreated into transcendental meditation, which, in simple terms, is a meditation technique where you mentally repeat a word or phrase until you reach a state of inner peace. In 1968, the Beatles even traveled to Rishikesh, India, and stayed at Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's ashram for 3 months. Next, the band released their double album, also known as the White Album, on November 22, 1968. Yellow Submarine was then released on January 13, 1969, which was the soundtrack to the animated film by the same name. The year before Yellow Submarine was released, Cynthia returned from a trip in 1968 and found a woman named Yoko Ono in her home dressed only in a bathrobe. John and Yoko seemed very unperturbed about Cynthia finding them. They had met at a London art gallery where John spoke to Yoko about her solo exhibition, and they had started an affair soon after. Given his blasé attitude about his wife finding out about them, John, unsurprisingly, divorced Cynthia and married Yoko in 1969 in Gibraltar. Sadly, Julian saw his father even less after his parents' divorce. In March of 1969, newlyweds John and Yoko held their bed-in for peace in room 902, the presidential suite at the Hilton Head in Amsterdam. To protest the Vietnam War, the couple invited reporters to come to their room throughout the day and ask them questions. John would later say, "We knew whatever we did was going to be in the papers. We decided to utilize the space we would occupy anyway, by getting married with a commercial for peace." 1969 also saw the release of the single Give Peace a Chance, which became an anti-war anthem.
The tensions within the band had now been simmering for years.
i.e., Yoko didn't break up the Beatles.
True. And John officially left the band in September of 1969 after the completion of Abbey Road, which was released on September 26, 1969. The breakup was kept under wraps until Paul announced his departure from the band in April 1970, roughly a month before their final album, Let It Be, which was recorded before Abbey Road, was released on May 8, 1970. John released his debut solo album, John Lennon Plastic Ono Band, on December 11, 1970. The album featured primal scream therapy. John and Yoko had attended intense therapy sessions with Dr. Arthur Janoff, who developed this therapy to address psychological issues by helping individuals confront and release repressed emotions from childhood, often through screaming. John said he found the therapy transformative and that it helped him understand and process his emotional baggage, including the trauma of his past. Unsurprisingly, the psychological community has slammed this type of therapy. Professor Sasha Fruholz of the Department of Psychology at the University of Zurich said, in my opinion, there is no scientific evidence that primal scream therapy has any positive effects in the treatment of mental and psychological disorders. Given that modern psychotherapy is an evidence based treatment approach, no serious psychotherapy school uses any elements of primal scream therapy today. But this was the 1970s, and counterculture and pushing norms was the name of the game. And really, if they thought it was helpful and it didn't hurt anyone else, then you do you.
Too right. John released 7 albums from 1970 to 1980, including his most successful solo album, Imagine, which was released on September 9th, 1971. That same year, John and Yoko moved to New York. Julian wouldn't see the increasingly absent John again until 1973. May Pang, John's former assistant, whom he was seeing while separated from Yoko, was instrumental in John and Julian reconnecting. John and May's relationship lasted 18 months, and John referred to it as his lost weekend. After John and Yoko reunited in 1974, Yoko became pregnant. Their son Sean was born on October 9th, 1975, which happened to be John's 35th birthday. After this, John took a step back from music and being in the public eye and really relished his role of being his son's primary parent. His commitment to his second son brought up a lot of feelings of guilt for his lack of presence in Julian's life. During this time, John spent time focusing on his love of creating art and began painting and drawing. John loved his new suitably artistic home of New York City. However, he was continually threatened with deportation by the Nixon administration. John was told this stemmed from his 1968 marijuana conviction in the UK, but he believed that the deportation threats were actually because of his peaceful activism against the Vietnam War. 2 years after Nixon resigned in disgrace, John was granted permanent U.S. residency. John and Yoko's first apartment was on Bank Street in New York's West Village. Unfortunately, some former tenants broke into their apartment and stole a TV, some artwork, and an address book. The couple understandably needed a space that hadn't been violated, so they moved to the Dakota in 1973. Interestingly, the Dakota was constructed between 1880 and 1884 in the German Renaissance style and was designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg for businessman Edward Cabot Clark. The building was one of the first large developments on the Upper West Side and is the oldest remaining luxury apartment building in New York City. It was used in the 1968 film Rosemary's Baby, which was directed by rapist Roman Polanski. Yes, I did have to throw that distinction in there.
I mean, let's not forget, he was 43 when he raped a 13-year-old and then fled to France in 1978 when he was out on bail, and he has never returned to the US.
Roman was also married to Sharon Tate, who would be murdered along with 4 other people by Charles Manson's followers on August 9th, 1969.
The Dakota was more secure, had a doorman, a security guard, and a gated driveway, which made them feel much safer. John relished the ability to live like a normal New Yorker. He would often walk in Central Park, which was conveniently located directly across from his home. He would walk to the local diner and people would say hi, but they wouldn't bug him. He liked the vibe. He was rarely bothered by fans. New Yorkers are used to famous people living among them and usually leave them alone. John and Yoko purchased a total of 5 separate apartments at the Dakota. They lived in a few, used one as a work studio for Yoko, another as a guest apartment, and the final one, which I love, was just for storage. John had vowed to be a different kind of dad with Sean.
Which is great, it really is, but that doesn't cancel out the kind of father he was to Julian.
So, very true.
Mhm.
Still, John had undoubtedly changed. He was content taking a step back from the public eye and being a quote unquote, I hate this, house husband. He did experience bouts of depression, but was turning a corner the last year of his life and was looking towards the future amidst writing and recording with Yoko what would be his last album, Double Fantasy. The first song released from the album was the aptly titled Just Like Starting Over. John, though, would barely have a chance to start over because of a man named Mark David Chapman. Mark David Chapman was born on May 10th, 1955, in Fort Worth, Texas, to David Chapman, a staff sergeant in the U.S. Air Force, and his mother, Diane, who was a nurse. After David left the Air Force, the family moved to Georgia so his father could take a job with American Oil. His father was a workaholic and distant, but Mark was close to his mother, who doted on him. David was abusive towards Diane and had a bad temper. Mark has said that he tried to step between them, but this did not de escalate the abuse. Diane downplayed any abuse, which unfortunately could just be because of the time period in which they were living, where it's okay to beat your wife.
Because she was really just another piece of property.
Mark hated his father and had thought about killing him. Diane would tell her sensitive and socially awkward son that he was born to greatness and how smart and special he was, that he was going to be somebody.
Which would have been a nice sentiment if he grew up to be someone different.
Too true. Despite his specialness, Mark did engage in normal kid activities like collecting coins and even started a neighborhood newspaper. However, Mark had trouble making friends at school. Diane, in an effort to make her son feel better, bought him a record player, and Mark became obsessed with the Beatles. He played their album, Meet the Beatles, over and over again. He was also fixated on The Wizard of Oz and would look forward to watching it every year. Okay, so for those of you who are young,
Hmm.
back in the day, before the plethora of television options, before cable TV and multiple streaming options, there wasn't a lot of choices on TV, and some movies would only be aired yearly. And for some people, there was a lot of anticipation. I don't get the whole Wizard of Oz thing, but you do you.
Yeah.
And along with anticipating watching the movie, Mark also collected Wizard of Oz memorabilia.
As the 1960s progressed, Mark was still a Beatles fan, but he couldn't deny that the band had changed. They no longer rocked their mop top hair and wore conservative suits and ties. The 1967 release of Magical Mystery Tour ushered in the changing looks and attitude of the band. John, Paul, George, and Ringo now had longer hair. They wore bell bottoms and brightly colored shirts, and they weren't afraid of a wild print. Since Mark idolized the Beatles, he was also keen to change his look. He had been a straight laced kid, but he now let his hair grow and wore bell bottom jeans and sandals. He started hanging out with the hippies at school and experimenting with drugs, with LSD being his first drug experience.
Which seems like quite the leap from no drugs to a mind altering one.
Might as well dive in head first, I guess. He also experimented with sniffing glue and lighter fluid, which also seems intense. Mark's parents could hardly fail to notice the changes in their son's looks and attitude. When his grades started to suffer too, they tried grounding him. He chose to ignore this stricter parenting. At the age of 14, he saved up his money, where he got it from isn't clear, and bought a plane ticket to Miami. He had the idea that he would try and live a hippie lifestyle. However, he quickly ran out of money and returned to Georgia. He then had his wallet stolen once he returned home. This made him, rightly, angry. Frustrated with the hippie lifestyle, he turned his focus to religion.
As he had gone all in With the hippie lifestyle, he now channeled all his energy into his religion. He became obsessed with this new devout way of life. He began evangelizing to everyone, trying to convert the non believers to Christ and the church, which I just have to say is one of my main issues with religion. If you are a believer, good on you, but quit trying to convert others to your way of thinking. I truly believe that if someone is interested or seeking religion, they are more than capable and able to find their way on their own.
Seriously, no one wants to be forcibly converted.
Yeah, relax the hard sell.
Hmm.
Really. Mark attended many prayer meetings and now said he hated the Beatles and he especially hated John. This hate was born from the 1966 comment John made to a British news outlet that the Beatles are more popular than Jesus. The quote received little acknowledgement in the UK. However, the quote was published in a US teen magazine several months later, and a huge backlash against the band erupted. Unsurprisingly, especially in the southern states, which is often deemed the Bible Belt of America, some teens protested by destroying Beatles albums and mementos.
And I am in no way trying to infringe on someone's right to protest or express their feelings. But what? Did they destroy them after buying them? You've already spent the money. How is that hurting the band?
Stop with that pesky logic.
I'll work on it. During this time, Mark started volunteering at the local YMCA and applied to be a camp counselor. As he did with all things he became interested in, he really immersed himself in the YMCA. The director was impressed with his dedication and his interaction with the kids. Mark loved being viewed as the kids' hero and was always there to answer questions and help with their activities. He had recently read The Catcher in the Rye and identified with Holden Caulfield's need to be a savior to children. Let me just admit that I haven't read it, I probably should, but that tidbit isn't making me pick up a copy. Having become a beloved camp counselor to whom the kids referred to as Captain Nemo, Mark even received the Camp Counselor of the Year award. As into religion and the organization as he was, Mark was upset by John's 1971 song Imagine. Mark felt it was a communist song because of the lyrics Imagine no possessions and no religion, too. He found it blasphemous because of the lyrics. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only sky. You know, like how it actually is. I'm probably going to get some hate for that.
You know I agree with you, and I love Imagine's lyrics.
So,
Angry with John, Mark bestowed his devotion to Todd Rundgren and listened to his music nonstop. John and Todd had been vocal about criticizing the other's music, so Mark was happy to align with Todd. As was the norm for Mark and his obsessions, he would badger others to listen to Todd's music, saying he was the best musician who ever lived.
we've all met that guy.
Mark attended Christian youth group meetings around town and decided he wanted to be a youth leader. Being hypersensitive and wanting to be the best at everything he did, he started singing and playing guitar at these meetings. He even wrote a song to play at one of them. However, the leaders of the youth group declined his request. Mark, of course, saw this as a personal affront and stopped attending meetings and evangelizing. After high school graduation, Mark moved to Chicago with his friend Michael McFarland and worked at the Chicago Youth for Christ organization. Mark and Michael performed musical and comedy skits at various churches and religious conventions. Mark's new goal was to become famous and perform on The Tonight Show. When this dream didn't materialize after a few months, Mark returned to Georgia and returned to working at the YMCA in various short term jobs. Leaving the evangelizing on the back burner, Mark now encouraged everyone to read The Catcher in the Rye. He reconnected with a girl he knew in grade school, Jessica Blankenship. They began dating and quickly became engaged.
Still eager to stay involved with the organization, Mark had applied for and was accepted into the YMCA's international program that took workers and volunteers to other countries. His first assignment was in Beirut, Lebanon. Shortly after his arrival, the country's capital broke out into a civil war. Luckily, all the YMCA workers and volunteers were evacuated. However, the experience of being in a war zone, no matter how short, had shaken Mark. Upon his return home, the Y offered him a job at Fort Chaffee, which was located in the city of Fort Smith, Arkansas, where he would be working with Vietnam refugees who had escaped their war torn country. Mark became the area coordinator and traveled with the director to various meetings. He was even on the welcoming committee when President Gerald Ford toured the refugee camp. Jessica came to the camp, and she and Mark spent their time planning their wedding and Mark's trip to her Tennessee college campus after the YMCA camp closed. After the refugee camp closed at the end of 1975, Mark went to Tennessee as he planned. He registered at the same school Jessica was attending, Covenant College. However, he was having difficulty with the coursework and fell behind. This led to him feeling inferior and worthless, so he dropped out of school and called off his engagement to Jessica. You know, the appropriate way to deal with negative feelings, running away from the situation that triggered them and hoping they never come back.
I mean, quitting and avoidance are definitely a theme in his life.
Definitely. After returning to Georgia, Mark got a job as a security guard, but was rather depressed about his life options. He has said at this time, I used to be Captain Nemo, and now I was Captain Nobody, which is sad, but when things didn't come easily or he failed at something, he would simply quit. He refused to deal with any criticism or perceived slight. He needed to be praised and was constantly looking for approval, truly believing that, as his mom had said, he was special. If that wasn't immediately clear to others, he became angry and frustrated. Even though he vacillated between liking and hating the Beatles, he did not want to be thought of as a nowhere man, which is the title of a Beatles song written by John that basically describes a man with no purpose and no direction in life. Mark, obviously feeling depressed about things not working out, decided life wasn't worth living and planned to go to Hawaii to end his life.
Before the end, however, he wanted to have one last hurrah. He looked at what hotels were considered the best in Waikiki on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. He decided on the Royal Hawaiian Hotel on Waikiki Beach and requested a room on the highest floor so he would have the best views of the sprawling Pacific Ocean. Mark ordered expensive meals and cocktails. He spent his days walking on the beach. After 5 days of luxury living, he was running out of money. Having experienced the good life, though, he wasn't sure if he still wanted to end his life. Mark moved to a cheap room at the Honolulu YMCA. While there, he called his former fiancée, Jessica, and told her that he had come to Hawaii to kill himself. But if she took him back, he would have a reason to live. Jessica, being put in the worst imaginable situation,
Yeah, that's clearly not emotional blackmail.
yeah, did not make any promises, smart on her, but
Mhm.
told him to come back to Georgia. Mark returned to Georgia, and Jessica said she was glad he didn't kill himself, but that she just wanted to be friends. Mark stayed with his parents while he decided what he wanted to do next. His parents were almost constantly arguing, and he couldn't handle being there. So he took $1,200 from savings and returned to Hawaii. Not sure what he would do once he arrived. It was May 1977, and any positive outlook he may have had about starting a new life in Hawaii was dashed when, after 2 months, he could only find low paying jobs. He rented a car and drove to the beach, this time intent on killing himself by carbon monoxide poisoning. We're not going to go into the specifics, but this plan failed. Mark took this as a sign from God that he was not meant to die. He went to a Honolulu mental health clinic and told them of his suicide attempt. Consequently, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital on June 21st, 1977. He was diagnosed not as psychotic, but as severely depressed. He was discharged only 2 weeks later, with the doctor saying he had made a miraculous recovery and seemed to be in a positive mental state.
That seems legit.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not how mental health works. Mark was friendly and charming at the hospital, which is probably just me, but I would question a patient at a psychiatric hospital who seems charming, thinking it is just a facade and what are their true intentions? But that's just my little black skeptical heart.
My heart is the same shade because I would be similarly suspicious.
The staff allowed him to volunteer after his release, which I don't think that's a good idea, but he then got a job working in the maintenance department. Even though the job didn't pay very well, he felt important and he thrived.
In this role, which maybe he shouldn't have had, Mark was able to ingratiate himself by being observant enough to see what other people needed. He then manipulated his personality to act in a way that would gain him acceptance. He paid attention and listened to the medical professionals, use medical jargon, and would then pepper his own conversations with these words. He was like a sponge who would soak up the pertinent information around him to fit in. However, after managing to fit in, he would become bored and would either look for kudos from those around him or something new to focus on. Bored and lacking attention, he realized that he could take a loan from the hospital's credit union and a 6-week leave of absence from his job.
Which is freaking amazing that this opportunity was open to other staff positions beyond just the medical professionals.
I bet that's not available now.
I'm sure.
Ready to take the gift lying in front of him, Mark planned to get a loan and travel around the world. In preparation, he began working with a local travel agent named Gloria Abe. Gloria was 27, though she looked much younger, and Mark was 22. Mark would stop by the travel agency numerous times during the week, either saying he needed to make changes to his itinerary or bringing Gloria little gifts. Gloria developed a crush on him. Mark, similarly, thought she was cute, but had never been comfortable making romantic moves or trying to pursue a relationship. Aware of Mark's awkwardness, Gloria made the first move. The day Mark was scheduled to leave for his trip, she arrived at the airport with a flower lei to wish him well. Before he departed, she kissed him. In response, Mark promised to write to her often during his travels. He later admitted that one of the things he found most attractive about her was that she was Japanese American, which he likened to Yoko Ono, John's wife, being of Japanese descent. He left on July 6, 1978, and was gone for 6 weeks. After traveling to Tokyo, Hong Kong, Seoul, Bangkok, Singapore, Paris, Dublin, and London, he returned to Hawaii on August 20th and began seeing Gloria seriously. They soon became engaged and married the following year. As their relationship grew stronger, his parents dissolved. Mark's mom finally divorced his dad and moved to Hawaii to be closer to Mark.
This was, rightly so, a lot for Gloria. Diane would often invite herself over and wanted to spend a lot of time with the newlyweds. Mark was promoted at the hospital and was working in the print department. However, he became overwhelmed with the more demanding job, which came with increased responsibility, and he became angry with coworkers and with tasks being assigned to him. His employer no longer felt he had the temperament to be in the public eye, and he was fired. Next, he got a job as an overnight security guard at a higher end hotel. He had become more isolated and was drinking a lot. This job taught him what was considered normal behavior and what behavior would cause security to take a closer look at certain people. Gloria grew concerned over Mark's increasing anger. His heavy drinking continued, and he even drank at work or on his way home. He insisted that they move to a nicer complex in a high rise building. He wanted a lifestyle that he couldn't afford, but definitely felt he deserved.
Always a good combination.
Yeah. At this time, he became interested in investing in art and borrowed money from his father in law and his mother to buy various pieces. He got conned into buying a Salvador Dali print for $5,000, which was worth much less. He also borrowed more and bought a Norman Rockwell print. He was living beyond his means, borrowing and buying art he could ill afford on a security guard and travel agent's salary. Their debt was building. He began lashing out at coworkers, neighbors, and even Gloria's boss. She left this employer because of Mark's behavior and started working for another company.
Poor Gloria.
Yeah, but things were about to go from bad to worse because in 1980, Mark checked out a book about John Lennon, One Day at a Time, by Anthony Fawcett from the local Honolulu library. The book focused on John Lennon's time in New York and showed numerous pictures of John and Yoko's apartment at the Dakota.
It became obvious to Mark that John and Yoko were living an enviable life in beautiful surroundings. John obviously had a comfortable life based on his years and years of commercial success, first with the Beatles and then as a solo artist. But seeing these pictures infuriated Mark, and he immediately decided that John was a phony. Mark was incensed that John had the lifestyle that Mark believed he should have. He had a low level job, was in debt, and wasn't important. He was also angry that the book described John as being a house husband, raising little Sean. To live what he saw as a life of ease, Mark decided he would quit his job and stay home as well. On his last day of work, he ominously signed out as John Lennon. Then, instead of working to pay off the debt, he spent this time trying to figure out other ways to get out of it. Gloria was appropriately alarmed by his behavior. Gloria's concern only grew when Mark told her about the little people. He said that there was a whole world of little people that had lived inside his mind since he was a child. These little people hadn't burst into his head one day. Rather, Mark had made up this world so he could feel powerful. These little people, or minions might be a better word.
Now I can only picture the characters from the movie.
Yeah, not quite that lighthearted and fun.
Yeah.
They looked up to him and he would use them as a sounding board. But when he was angry, he would turn on the little people and wipe them out in his mind. However, these creatures of his creation always came back to give him praise. He told Gloria that they had returned when he was an adult to help him organize his life. He would use them as a committee to either approve or reject his various financial decisions.
Gloria was afraid to say anything. If this make believe world kept him from acting out violently, she was accepting of this. Mark was isolated, not working, living in this imaginary world, and becoming increasingly angry with John and all the other phonies in the world. But John was the worst in his mind. He would later admit to a lot of jealousy and envy. He felt John had everything, surrounded by wealth, while singing Imagine No Possessions. He decided he would kill John. Mark thought maybe he could acquire John's fame by killing him. And John wasn't the only person Mark had fantasized about killing. He had a list of potential famous victims, which included Johnny Carson, Elizabeth Taylor, Paul McCartney, George C. Scott, David Bowie, and Ronald Reagan. Police found this list after John's murder. Mark did get another job as a security guard, but quit in 1980. He flew from Hawaii to New York in November of 1980. While there, he said he attended both Reagan's and Carter's election night parties. We couldn't verify this. He didn't do much else. He hadn't really formulated a plan, so he returned to Hawaii.
On October 24th, 1980, the same day Mark quit his job and began plummeting down his descent into violence, John released his first single in 5 years, the appropriately named Just Like Starting Over. This was the first single released from the upcoming album, Double Fantasy, which was scheduled for a November 1980 release. Days later, it seemed that Mark had both a plan and the murderous will to act on it, because on October 27th, Mark purchased a .38 Smith & Wesson handgun at a Honolulu gun shop for $169. He then walked over to the police station and filled out a gun permit. For this permit, he answered no to the question, "Have you ever been hospitalized for a mental illness?" With that lie, he became armed and incredibly dangerous. Gloria would later comment that Mark had seemed in a better mood lately, so when he told her he was going to take a solo trip to New York City, Gloria didn't ask any questions. Mark sold the Norman Rockwell print for $5,000, and rather than pay his father in law back, he kept the proceeds to fund his trip. Because he planned to travel in style, he bought a new suit and booked the Waldorf Astoria for 2 nights. $5,000 in 1980 is just under $20,000 in today's money. Mark flew to New York on October 29th with his unloaded gun in his checked bag. The pre 9/11 security meant it went unnoticed in spite of New York not allowing any guns in the city, even to those with a permit. To play it safe, Mark didn't bring any bullets. He thought he would be less likely to get in trouble if authorities found just the gun. Once in New York, Mark checked into the Waldorf Astoria, then walked to the Dakota. He chatted up the security guards, telling them he had traveled from Hawaii and was a big John Lennon fan. He told them he was hoping to see John. The guards, doing their jobs, told him they thought John was traveling out of town.
Mark then went to the next phase of his plan and called a New York gun dealer asking for bullets for a .38. but was told he wouldn't be able to purchase any. Mark was becoming angry and also was realizing it would take longer than he had anticipated to find and kill John, and he had already spent a lot of money. He had been treating himself to expensive dinners and front row tickets to Broadway plays. He checked out of his luxurious digs and checked into a cheaper midtown hotel that was even closer to the Dakota. Realizing he couldn't get bullets in New York, he remembered that his old friend Dana Reeves still lived in Georgia and was now a deputy. On November 5th, he flew to Atlanta to see if his old friend would help him out. He stayed with Dana and his family and told him that he had bought a 38 for protection because New York City was a dangerous place. He was unable to purchase any ammunition. Dana, being the helpful friend, gave him some standard bullets, but Mark wanted hollow point bullets, saying he wanted the bullets that would do the most damage just in case. Dana gave him 5 hollow point bullets. Hollow point bullets are designed for optimal damage. They expand on impact, creating a larger wound and causing the bullet to mushroom upon hitting soft tissue. So, their main purpose is to cause the most amount of damage and stopping power. And they are apparently popular with, of course, law enforcement, self defense warriors, and hunting aficionados. Mark flew back to New York, bullets in hand, on November 9th.
Having blown most of his money on first class flights, fancy dinners, and nice hotels, Mark checked into a YMCA upon his return to New York. Mark then called Gloria November 11th and told her that he had bought a gun in Hawaii and brought it to New York to kill John Lennon. He told her, "You probably don't believe me, but it's true." But she replied that she did believe him and began crying and begging him to come home. After saying he would return home and that her love had saved him, he came back to Hawaii on November 12th. However, upon returning to Hawaii, things didn't improve for Mark. He felt like a nobody, and the pressures of everyday life were weighing on him. The fact that he hadn't even completed his mission weighed heaviest of all. Even though Mark had confessed to Gloria of what he planned to do in New York, she didn't contact the police. Instead, she suggested that they attend church more regularly and turn their lives over to God for strength and help. Gloria also didn't seek mental health care for Mark, believing that their faith in God would solve all of their problems. Mark, of course, was just pretending and going through the motions. He wasn't sure he even believed in God anymore. He kept thinking that to ever matter or be somebody, he needed to kill John. He still had the guns and the bullets. All he needed to do was return to New York.
Telling Gloria he wanted to return to New York to work on a children's book,
Did she buy this? Had he even started a children's book?
Gloria seemed to be able to ignore all the red flags. And of course, there was no children's book. So he flew to New York on December 6th. He checked into the YMCA closest to the Dakota. He, along with other fans, camped outside the Dakota to get a glimpse of John. Mark realized that the other fans had brought albums or memorabilia for John to sign if they were lucky enough to see and talk to him. So Mark purchased John's most recent album, Double Fantasy. He went back to the Dakota and waited until the late afternoon. However, John didn't appear, so he went back to the YMCA. John returned to the Dakota shortly after Mark had returned to the Y. They had just missed crossing paths. On December 7th, Mark checked out of the Y and into a Sheraton hotel. By 9:30 a.m., he was back camping outside the Dakota. He had dressed comfortably, planning on staying outside for as long as he needed to complete his plan. He left to get some lunch at the Sheraton and on the way stopped at a bookstore. He purchased a Playboy magazine, which had an interview with John. This may be the only time I have heard someone purchasing a Playboy to actually read the article. Just kidding. I'm sure he also looked at the pictures.
That's great.
Mark did not see John and returned to the Y. The morning of December 8th, 1980, Mark prepared to leave his room early and head to the Dakota. Before leaving his room, he laid out his passport, his Bible, open to the book of John, which he had written Lennon next to, a Wizard of Oz poster, and a photo of himself with Vietnamese children at Fort Chaffee. Before leaving, he loaded the gun with the 5 hollow point bullets. On his way to the Dakota, he stopped at another bookstore and purchased a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He had given his copy to Gloria, telling her to read it so she could understand him better. He got to Dakota, again at 9:30 a.m., saying hello to the security guards. At about 10:30, John exited the building and into a waiting car. Mark was so engrossed with reading that he missed seeing John get into the waiting car. Paul Gorsh, a freelance photographer who was often outside the Dakota trying to get photos of John and Yoko, talked to Mark and later said that he seemed pleasant enough. He told Paul that he was a huge Beatles fan, that this was his second trip to NYC. Paul asked him where he was staying, I'm sure simply making conversation. And Mark snapped at him, asking, why did he want to know this information?
Be cool, man.
Yeah, right. Don't draw attention to yourself.
While Mark was outside, not being cool, in their apartment, John and Yoko had one of their most iconic photo shoots, and not just because it would be the last photo of John. Famed photographer Annie Leibovitz from Rolling Stone magazine took a photo from above of Yoko laying down, fully clothed, with her long hair fanned above her. John is naked, curled next to Yoko with his arms circling her head, kissing her cheek. The famous picture would be featured as the cover of the magazine's commemorative January 22nd, 1981 issue. After their last photo shoot, the couple left the Dakota to go to the record plant to work on a new single, Walking on Thin Ice. As they exited the Dakota, they met a fan who had been standing on the sidewalk on and off for the last few days, just hoping to meet or to run into John. That fan was, of course, Mark. A little stunned, he held out the album to John. John signed the album, John Lennon, December 1980, and handed it back to Mark, asking, Is that all you want? Mark squeaked out a thank you. He was so excited that he showed Paul his signed album and said he couldn't believe he had just met John Lennon.
A bystander actually took a picture of John signing the album, and I looked for it, and you can see Mark in the corner of the pic. It's rather eerie knowing that Mark will murder John just hours later.
I think that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, this signed record has changed hands and been sold several times. The last information I found was that it sold for 1.5 million in 2020. Mark reconsidered going through with his plans since John had been kind to him. But that's not generally how mental illness works, and rational thought was soon gone with the continued focus on completing his plan. Mark stayed outside the Dakota the entire time John and Yoko were at the recording studio. Mark was now alone except for the security personnel in front of the Dakota. He held the autographed album in one hand, and his other hand was in his pocket, the pocket that held the gun. In his other pocket, he had the Catch from the Rye. He planned to lay down next to a dying John while holding the book. He believed that John's blood would seep into him and he would become Holden Caulfield. A little before 11 p.m., a car arrived carrying John and Yoko.
Yoko exited the car first, with John walking behind her. As John walked past Mark, Mark withdrew the gun and shot 5 times. 4 bullets hit John in the back and shoulder. Yoko heard the shots, ducked, and ran out of the way. Mark was surprised that John didn't fall immediately. In fact, John was able to walk about 6 steps to the lobby of the building, where he fell, saying, I've been shot, which is such a horrifying realization that you would have to go into shock. Someone called 911 and the police arrived 2 minutes later. But although the police may have gotten to the scene quickly, no ambulance had come with them. The police didn't know how many times John had been shot, but they knew that this was a dire situation. So rather than waiting for an ambulance, the police put John in their squad car and drove him to what was then Roosevelt Hospital, but what is now Mount Sinai West. While there is conflicting information about if John died in the police car or at the hospital, we know that his death was called at 11:15 p.m. ER doctor Stephen G. Lynn said the bullets had hit him in all the wrong places, which meant that there was really no hope of saving him. He had simply lost too much blood. An autopsy found 2 bullets went into his back and through his left lung. Another hit his left shoulder and went through his left lung before lodging in his neck. The fourth and final bullet went straight to his left arm bone. The news of John's death went out almost immediately from the hospital because, by a weird coincidence, producer Alan J. Weiss for WABC TV was there being treated after a motorcycle accident. In the wake of the fatal shooting, there was more than the usual hum and busyness of an emergency room. People were screaming, and Alan J. Weiss knew something big was going on. So he called his WABC station and relayed the tragic news.
The station was actually playing Monday Night Football, and it was actually Howard Cosell, famed sportscaster, that broke the news of John's death. Stevie Wonder, who was performing in Oakland, California at the time, stopped his concert to relay the news to fans. This was huge. If you were a Beatles fan at the time of his death, this was obviously devastating news, much more than the prior bad news with the Beatles that they had broken up.
You would hope that the murder of one of the members would matter more than there not being another Beatles album, but you never know.
I mean, you would hope. Paul and John had repaired their fractured relationship before John's death. The Beatles' breakup was rather acrimonious, but they were mainly just tired of the constraints of being in the band together. They didn't hate each other, but it was time for them to do their own thing.
You can't really expect that level of success not to bring about some kind of tension.
True. After killing John, Mark just stood there with the gun in his hand. A security guard ran over to him and asked if he knew what he had done, taking the gun out of his hand and throwing it across the courtyard. Mark walked towards the sidewalk and took his book out of his pocket. He took off his coat and hat so people could see he was no longer armed. He didn't want to be shot. He opened the book and tried to read, but he couldn't concentrate. When police arrived, he held his hands in the air and said, "Don't hurt me. I'm unarmed. I acted alone. I'm the only one." As he was being forced into the police car, he yelled out, "My book, my book." He had dropped the book while being handcuffed. An officer picked up the book and put it into an evidence bag. Once inside the squad car, he apologized to officers for causing so much trouble.
Crowds of fans had congregated both in front of the police station and the Dakota, so police took Mark to the basement for his safety. The next day, he was taken to Bellevue Hospital for his continued protection and to be evaluated by a psychiatrist. As newspapers called him the most unpopular man in the world, he spoke to a psychiatrist about the literary and Hollywood fantasies he had been obsessed with since childhood. He recounted how he had used these fantasies to attach meaning to his life. Like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, he wanted to find his way home and felt that he was in a strange place, a place that didn't make sense. After the shooting, a reporter in Hawaii heard the news and called Gloria. Gloria then called the police precinct in New York City and asked to speak with Mark. Anticipating that Gloria would receive a lot of calls from the media asking her questions about him because he was now famous as the person who killed John Lennon, Mark told her not to speak to them. At the time of his father's murder, Julian was 17 and living in Wales. After waking up with a feeling that something bad had happened, he went downstairs and opened the curtains, surprised to see lots of reporters outside of the house. That's how he found out his dad was dead.
People suck.
They really fucking do. Hasn't Julian been through enough? If you needed more proof of how horrible humans are, before John's body was cremated, someone took a photo of his body in the morgue and the New York Post published it on the front page.
Of course they did, because that's the kind of trash tabloids live for.
Money over morals. With John's cremation in the works, Yoko released a statement that there wouldn't be a funeral, which makes sense since it would have been utter chaos. She said a 10-minute silent vigil would be more appropriate, and on December 14th, 1980, at 2 o'clock p.m., people around the world observed this 10-minute silent vigil.
Days before, on December 9th, Mark wore two bulletproof vests for his trip to the courthouse and his arraignment, because authorities believed there was a high probability that someone would try and shoot him. Mark's court-appointed lawyer, Herbert Adelberg, withdrew from the case amid threats of lynching from angry fans.
And I don't think you can blame him for that.
Not at all. Mark's second attorney, Jonathan Marks, initially argued a not guilty by reason of insanity plea. Jonathan said representing Mark was difficult due to his frequent outbursts and obsession with the Catcher in the Rye. Every psychiatrist, those for both the defense and prosecution, said they believed Mark was suffering from a mental illness. Of what illness and to what degree was argued between the various doctors. Mark says he tried to be good, but that didn't get him anywhere, so the evil part of himself took over. He couldn't become famous or relevant as a hero, so he became an anti-hero.
As for some of these doctors' conclusions, Dr. Richard Bloom interviewed Mark several times in prison and diagnosed him as having paranoid schizophrenia. The psychiatrist said he was elusive in his responses and a very interesting case. Part of what made Mark interesting was that he suffered from delusions of grandiosity. Dr. Bloom believed that he was psychologically incapable of controlling his actions on the night he murdered John. He thought that his psychosis began in childhood, possibly due to stress at home and the abuse of his mother by his father that young Mark had witnessed. He believed the psychosis was then exacerbated by his heavy alcohol and drug use as a teen. Dr. Daniel Schwartz, a forensic psychiatrist, also examined Mark several times. He concluded that Mark had schizophrenia with the additional diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. Dr. Schwartz said that Mark was suffering from delusions and hallucinations, and that Mark's world was filled with gods, demons, and an imaginary kingdom. He further stated that Mark understood the crime he committed and the consequences of his actions and was competent to stand trial.
With Mark's competency established on June 22nd, 1981, Mark pled guilty to second-degree murder in a closed courtroom proceeding. At his sentencing hearing on August 24th, when asked if he had anything to say, he read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye. The judge sentenced him to 20 years to life. Once incarcerated, he vacillated between his fixation on the Bible or The Catcher in the Rye. He said that he was his generation's Holden Caulfield, and every generation had one. Mark has expressed remorse and shame over the years. Gloria, who knew of Mark's preparations for killing John but took zero action, was not charged. Mark would later say that he harbored a deep seated resentment towards his wife, that she didn't go to anyone, not the police or anyone else, and say, "My husband has bought a gun and he is going to kill John Lennon."
I do hear that, but I get that you wouldn't want to believe someone was serious if they told you of a plan like that, even if you knew they were ill.
I mean, how many times have we heard, "I didn't think he was serious"?
It
But
is true.
the audacity of him to blame her, "She should have stopped me." Really?
Yeah,
Really?
it's her fault.
Yeah, of course, of course. After sentencing, Mark was moved to Attica State Prison, where in 1971, 43 prisoners had died after the bloodiest prison riot in U.S. history. Finding out where he would be incarcerated, Mark panicked and refused to come out of his cell. A prison chaplain came to see him, and only after it was agreed that he would be placed in protective custody did he give in and come out of his cell. He was to be housed separately from the general population for his own safety, as he was considered a notorious prisoner. Gloria moved to upstate New York to be closer to her husband and visited him almost every day, even though when he was housed at Rikers Island, he had written her saying goodbye and he would never speak to her again.
Gloria urged Mark to pray because she now believed he had been possessed by demonic beings. And there goes my understanding for Gloria.
I mean, she needs to find someone other than Mark to blame.
I guess, but I don't think that's helping his delusions.
True.
Instead of praying, Mark went on a hunger strike for 30 days and called out to Satan. He was then sent to the prison psych ward and force fed through an IV. After this incident, he recommitted himself to Christianity and to Gloria. But a little while after this recommitment to religion, Mark began acting out and refusing to see Gloria. After Gloria was threatened by an ex con, she moved back to Hawaii for her own safety. However, she is still married and remains committed to Mark. They are allowed one conjugal visit per year on the prison campus, and Gloria travels 5,000 miles each time to a private trailer on the prison grounds, where Mark is allowed up to 44 hours with her because of his good behavior. Mark's mother, on the other hand, only visited him twice at Attica State Prison before she died in 2004. Mark was incarcerated at Attica until 2012. He was then moved to the Wenday Correctional Facility and finally to the Greenhaven Correctional Facility, where he remains today.
Is it just me, or does 5,000 miles seem like a long way to go yearly for just a booty call?
It really does. It really, really does. In response to John's murder, each of his three bandmates honored their fallen friend in their own way. Paul McCartney wrote the song Here Today, Ringo Starr left the Bahamas where he was vacationing and came to New York to help Yoko with Sean, who was only 5. And George Harrison, who was in the studio recording the song all those years ago, would later change the lyrics as a tribute to John. Paul and Ringo also added contributions to the song, their first collaboration since the Beatles had ended. As a result of his sentence of 20 years to life, Mark became eligible for parole in 2000 and is entitled to a hearing every 2 years. So far, he has had 13 parole hearings and has been denied each time. Some reasons for these denials include that his release would deprecate the seriousness of the crime and serve to undermine respect for the law, and that Mark's choice to grant media interviews maintained his notoriety. For her part, Yoko always writes a letter to the parole board asking them to please not let him out. She genuinely thinks Julian, Sean, or herself could be in danger if he was released, which is hard not to agree with.
Julian was excluded from John's will, though a trust fund was supposed to be shared between Julian and Sean. Julian sued John's estate. Julian said in an interview with The Telegraph in 1998, Dad could talk about peace and love out loud to the world, but he could never show it to the people who supposedly meant the most to him, his wife and son. How can you talk about peace and love and have a family in bits and pieces? No communication, adultery, divorce. You can't do it, not if you're being true and honest with yourself. Julian eventually secured a further settlement from the estate in 1996, but the number was never revealed. Though the press has speculated over the years about a fractured relationship between John's two sons, Julian told The Guardian, I'm thankful that Sean and I get on like a house on fire. We're best buddies.
Which is big of him, considering how differently John treated them.
True, he's obviously mature and well rounded enough to realize Sean wasn't the one to blame.
Mhm.
Central Park dedicated a 2.5 acre near the Dakota where John would go on walks with Sean as Strawberry Fields on October 9th, 1985, which would have been John's 45th birthday. There's a large circular mosaic with inlaid stones with the word Imagine. Fans continue to visit this area, especially on John's birthday and on the anniversary of his death. A lot of people want to hate on Yoko and blame her for the breakup of the Beatles, as we already mentioned. I think she's misunderstood. I also think a lot of the initial hate she got was racially based. She lived in the same apartment she shared with John until the pandemic, when she moved to the 600-acre farm in upstate New York that her and John bought as a retreat in 1978. She is 92 years old.
I hope she's found some peace there. People need to get over their racism and misogyny and stop blaming one woman for the variety of reasons that led to the Beatles' disbandment.
I mean, move on, people. I still found articles from the very recent past that still flip and blame her. My God, people, seriously.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, that's where we're going to leave it today. Next week, we'll be finishing our series on when celebrity fandom turns to murder with the case of Selena Quintanilla.
All the sources we use for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, feel free to email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Terrifyingly Typical Podcast on Instagram and at Terrifyingly Typical Pod on TikTok. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of the case. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next week.